I spent 40 years working as a registered nurse, taking care of others while saving every extra penny to pay off my mortgage. I truly thought my home was my sanctuary, a place where I would grow old in peace. When my son, Christopher, and his wife Tiffany asked to move in to save for their own down payment, I welcomed them with open arms. I wanted to be a supportive mother, but then I fell ill. While I was weak in a hospital bed, Christopher brought me papers to sign. I trusted him. I thought it was just a medical power of attorney, but I was wrong. It was a trap. I had signed my entire life away to his mother-in-law. I was left with nothing but a suitcase, a tiny apartment, and a broken heart. They thought they had won, but they forgot one very important detail about the house. Before I tell you how the tables turned, and why my son is now standing on my porch begging for a place to sleep, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Please leave a comment and tell me your city and state. It truly warms my heart to see our community growing from all over the country. Note: while this story is a fictional narrative created for your entertainment, the message and the lesson it carries about protecting yourself and your assets are very real and very important. I still remember the day I walked through the front door of my house for the very first time. The air smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Back then, I was a young woman with a nursing degree and a heart full of dreams. I was a registered nurse. For those who know that life, you understand that it is not just a job. It is a calling. But it is a calling that takes a heavy toll on your body and your spirit. I spent 40 years in those hospital corridors. 40 years? It sounds like such a long time when you say it out loud. I remember the weight of my white scrubs and the way my feet would ache after a 12-hour shift. Sometimes it was 14 hours. Sometimes it was 16. I worked the night shifts, the ones no one else wanted, because they paid a little bit more. I did it all for one reason. I wanted to own my own home. I wanted to have a piece of the American dream that was truly, fully mine. Every single paycheck I received, I would sit down at my kitchen table with a pencil and a calculator. I made sure to pay the mortgage first. Then, I would add a little bit extra toward the principal. $10 here, $50 there. I sacrificed so much. I did not go on fancy vacations. I did not buy a new car every 3 years. Instead, I put my money into those 4 walls. I remember the nights I would come home, exhausted, and just sit on the porch steps in the dark. I would look up at the roof and tell myself, one day, this will be paid for. One day. No bank will be able to take this away from me. My neighbors would see me coming and going at all hours of the night, my stethoscope still around my neck. They knew me as the nurse who never stopped. Finally, after 30 years of monthly payments, that glorious day arrived. I remember the feeling of the envelope in my mailbox. It was the deed. The house was finally mine. I sat at my dining room table and cried. I ran my hands over the wood grain of the table, and I felt a sense of peace that I cannot even describe. I was a woman of independent means. I had earned my retirement. That house was my sanctuary. It was where I hosted Thanksgiving dinners for my son, Christopher. It was where I planted the rose bushes in the backyard that bloomed every June. Every corner of that house had a story. Every creak in the floorboards was familiar to me. It was not just an asset or a piece of real estate. It was the physical manifestation of my life's work. It was my safety net, my pride, and my joy. I thought I would stay there until the very end. I never imagined that the person I loved most, my own son, would be the one to turn my sanctuary into a nightmare. But as I have learned, greed can change a person. Even a son you thought you knew. It began on a Sunday afternoon, just like any other. The sun was setting over the oak trees in my backyard, casting long golden shadows across the kitchen floor. I had just finished baking a pot roast. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the air. It was a smell that meant home. Christopher and Tiffany had come over for dinner, which was something they did quite often back then. I loved it. I truly did. After 40 years of working those long hospital shifts, the silence of my retirement was sometimes a bit too loud. I missed the noise. I missed the feeling of being needed. As we sat at the dining room table, the same table I had polished every week for 30 years, I noticed Christopher was fidgeting with his napkin. He kept looking over at Tiffany. She was smiling, but it was that specific kind of smile she used when she wanted something. It was bright, polished, and a little bit too perfect. "Mom," Christopher started, his voice dropping to that serious tone he used when he was about to ask for a favor. "You know how much we want to buy our own place. We want to start a family. We want a backyard. Just like this one." I nodded, feeling a sense of pride. I wanted that for them too. Every parent wants their child to have their own piece of the world. But then he continued. He talked about the economy. He talked about how the housing market was impossible, and how interest rates were climbing higher every single day. He told me that they had calculated everything, and if they could just save for 2 more years, they would have the $60,000 they needed for a proper down payment. "We were thinking," he said, pausing to look at Tiffany again. "What if we moved in here? Just for a little while. We could pay for the groceries, help with the yard work, and put every other penny into our savings account. It would change our lives, Mum." My heart swelled. I saw it as a beautiful opportunity. I saw it as a way to have my son back under my roof, to hear laughter in the hallways again. I did not see it as a calculation. I did not see it as a strategy. I saw it through the eyes of a mother who loved her son more than her own comfort. "Of course," I told them, my voice warm and sincere. "There is plenty of room. This house is too big for just me anyway." Tiffany jumped up and hugged me. She called me a lifesaver. She told me I was the best mother-in-law in the world. I believed her. I really did. Within 2 weeks, their boxes were piled high in my hallway. At first, it was lovely. We had coffee together in the mornings. We watched the evening news together. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change. The guest room was not enough for them. They needed more closet space. Then they needed to reorganize my pantry because Tiffany did not like where I kept the spices. Then they started talking about how the furniture in the living room was dated and cluttered. I found myself retreating to my own bedroom more and more, just to feel like I was still in my own home. I was a guest in my own kitchen. I told myself it was just the adjustment period. I told myself I was being sensitive. I was a nurse. I was used to accommodating others. But I did not realize that I was opening the door to the people who would eventually try to lock me out of it. I was happy to help them save their $60,000. But I did not know that their real goal was much, much bigger than a down payment. They did not want to save for a house. They wanted my house, and they were just waiting for the right moment to take it. The winter of that year was particularly brutal. A bitter wind blew in from the north, and the flu was spreading through the town like wildfire. Being a retired nurse, I thought I was careful. I washed my hands. I took my vitamins. I stayed away from crowds. But one Tuesday morning, I woke up with a chill that went straight to my bones. My head felt like it was filled with lead, and my chest was heavy. By Thursday, I was in the hospital. It is a strange thing, to be a patient in the same halls where you used to be the one giving the care. I knew the sounds of the machines. I knew the smell of the industrial bleach and the antiseptic. But this time, I was the one in the thin white gown. I was the one hooked up to the IV drip. The fever was high, soaring to over 102 degrees. I was drifting in and out of sleep, my mind caught in a fog of medication and exhaustion. Christopher was there every day. He sat by my bed, holding my hand. I felt so lucky. I looked at him and thought, I raised a good man. I thought his devotion was born of love. I did not know it was born of opportunity. On the 3rd day, when the doctors had given me something heavy to help me sleep, Christopher leaned in close. He had a stack of papers in his hand. His voice was a whisper, gentle and reassuring. "Mom," he said, "the hospital needs you to sign some forms. It is just the medical power of attorney, just in case things get worse. I need to be able to talk to the doctors for you. You trust me, right?" I could barely keep my eyes open. The words on the page were a blur of black ink against a white background. I could not have read them even if I wanted to. My hand was shaking as he placed a pen between my fingers. "Just sign here and here, and one more at the bottom." He guided me. I trusted him. He was my son. He was the boy I had tucked in at night. He was the man I had helped move back home. I signed the papers. I thought I was protecting my health. I thought I was making things easier for him in case of an emergency. But Christopher had not brought me a medical power of attorney. He had brought me a quitclaim deed, a legal document that, with one simple signature, transferred the entire ownership of my home, my 40 years of hard work, my sanctuary, directly into his name. He had used my vulnerability, my fever, and my trust to rob me of the only thing I had left. As I fell back into a deep, medicated sleep, I remember feeling a sense of relief. I thought I was safe. I thought my family was looking out for me. I did not see the way Christopher tucked those papers into his briefcase. I did not see the way he avoided looking at the nurses as he walked out of the room. I spent another week in the hospital recovering. When I finally came home, I was weak, but I was happy to be back. I walked into my living room, ready to sit in my favorite chair. But the chair was gone. In its place was a modern, cold-looking sofa. Tiffany was standing in the kitchen, sipping coffee. She did not look at me with the same smile she used to have. Her eyes were different now. They were sharp. They were cold. "Oh, you are back," she said, her voice flat. "We have been busy while you were away. We have made a lot of changes. Christopher, tell her the news." I looked at my son, waiting for him to tell me about their savings or their plans for the future. But he just looked at the floor. That was the moment I realized that the fog in my head was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break over my life. I had signed the papers, and in doing so, I had unknowingly signed away my right to exist in my own home. Life has a way of changing when you least expect it, like a sudden storm rolling in over the horizon on a clear summer day. For a few months, things had settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Christopher and Tiffany were living in my house, and I was trying my best to stay out of their way. But then, the phone call came that changed everything. Tiffany's father passed away suddenly. A heart attack, they said. Just like that. Mrs. Gable was a widow. I felt for her. I truly did. I am a nurse, and I have seen grief in all its forms. I sent flowers. I went to the funeral. I held Tiffany's hand as she cried. I thought, as one woman of a certain age to another, that we might find some common ground. But I did not realize that Mrs. Gable's grief was being used as a tool, a lever to pry me out of my own life. A few weeks after the funeral, the atmosphere in my house shifted. It became heavy. Christopher started talking about family values at the dinner table. He would lean back in his chair, looking at the ceiling, and talk about how sad it was for an elderly woman to live all alone in a big, empty house. He used the word lonely over and over again. He said it was a tragedy. He said that in a civilized society, families take care of their own. "Mom," he said to me one evening while we were sitting on the porch, "Tiffany is so worried about her mother. Mrs. Gable is so fragile right now. She is falling apart. She needs her family around her. She needs support." I agreed with him. I told him that maybe we should have her over for dinner more often. I suggested we help her look for a nice, smaller condo near the park. But Christopher just shook his head. He had that look on his face, that stubborn look he used to get when he was a little boy and wanted an extra scoop of ice cream. No, Mom, he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. A condo is not the answer. She needs to be with us. She needs to be under a roof where people love her. It is the right thing to do. It is the Christian thing to do. I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach. I asked him where she would stay. We only had 3 bedrooms, and they were already full. But he did not answer me. He just got up and walked inside, leaving me alone in the dark with the sound of the crickets. A week later, a moving truck pulled into my driveway. I was standing in the kitchen, drying a dish, when I saw it. I did not remember anyone asking me if Mrs. Gable could move in. No one had consulted me. No one had asked for my permission. But there she was, stepping out of a black town car, dressed in expensive mourning clothes, looking more like a queen arriving at her palace than a grieving widow. Christopher and Tiffany ran out to meet her. They treated her like she was made of glass. They carried her suitcases, her hat boxes, her dozens of shopping bags. They marched right past me in the hallway. Mrs. Gable gave me a small, tight smile. It was the kind of smile you give to a housekeeper. "Oh, thank you for having me," she whispered, her voice sounding practiced and airy. "It is so cozy here." Cozy. That was the word she used. But soon, my cozy home began to disappear under a mountain of her things. Her floral curtains replaced my simple blinds. Her porcelain figurines took over the mantelpiece. She brought her own smells, a heavy, cloying perfume and the scent of expensive hairspray. Christopher became her shadow. If she coughed, he was there with a glass of water. If she sighed, he was asking her what was wrong. And all the while, they were whispering. In the kitchen, in the backyard, in the hallways late at night. I could hear the murmur of their voices through the walls. I felt like a ghost in my own hallways. I was the one who had worked 40 years to pay for that roof. But suddenly, I was the only one who seemed to be in the way. The plan was already in motion. The arrival of Mrs. Gable was not an act of mercy. It was the final piece of the puzzle. They were building a new family, and they were building it on the foundation I had laid. But they were planning to leave me out of the blueprints. Sunday dinner used to be the highlight of my week. It was a tradition we had kept for years. I would roast a chicken, or make a pot roast with potatoes and carrots from the garden. It was a time for us to sit down, turn off the television, and just be a family. But that Sunday, the air in the dining room felt thin. It felt cold, despite the heat coming from the oven. Mrs. Gable was sitting in my usual spot at the head of the table. I did not say anything. I did not want to cause a scene. I just took a seat on the side. Next to the window, Christopher was carving the meat, but his hands were shaking just a little bit. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his plate, focusing on the gravy, like it was the most important thing in the world. Tiffany was the one who started it. She cleared her throat, a sharp, artificial sound that made me look up. She had a look of forced concern on her face. "We have been talking," she began, her eyes flickering over to her mother, "about the living arrangements, about what is best for everyone. You know how much my mother is struggling. Her knees are bad, and she gets so winded going up and down the stairs. She really needs a space that is appropriate for her condition." I nodded slowly, still not quite understanding where she was going with this. "Well," I said, "maybe we can move some of her things to the downstairs guest room. It is smaller, but it is closer to the kitchen." Christopher finally looked up, but his eyes were hard. There was no warmth in them. There was no love. There was only a cold, calculated resolve. "No, Mom," he said, his voice flat. "That won't work. Mrs. Gable needs the master suite. It has a walk-in shower. It has the extra space for her sitting area. It is the only room in the house that truly meets her needs. She is fragile, and she needs her family around her, in a way that makes her feel respected. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at him, my own son, and I felt like I was looking at a stranger. The master suite, my room, the room where I had slept for 30 years, the room where I had sought comfort after long, exhausting shifts at the hospital, the room where I kept my husband's memory alive. You want me to move out of my own bedroom? I asked, my voice trembling. For your mother-in-law? Christopher, I own this house. You are guests here, both of you, and Mrs. Gable is a guest as well. That was when Tiffany leaned forward. She had a smug, sharp smile on her face. It was the smile of someone who had already won. Actually. Mom, she said. The word. Mom, sounding like a sneer. Do you remember those papers you signed last year? When were you so sick with the flu? The ones you thought were for the medical power of attorney. You really should have read them more carefully. You actually signed a quitclaim deed. You gifted the house to Christopher. Legally, he is the owner. You are the one who is a guest. My heart stopped. I felt a coldness spread through my chest, a numbness that went all the way to my fingertips. I remembered that day in the hospital. I remembered the fever, the fog, the way I had trusted my son when he put the pen in my hand. I had signed my life away without even knowing it. Christopher? I whispered, looking for some sign of regret on his face. Is this true? Did you do this to me? He looked away. He could not meet my eyes. It was for your own good. Mom, he said, his voice sounding like a rehearsed script. You are getting older. You shouldn't have to worry about the taxes or the insurance. We think it is best if you move into that senior apartment complex near the highway. You know, the one with the community center? You will be around people your own age. It will be much quieter for you. The apartment is near the highway. I knew that place. It was a grey, drab building, surrounded by concrete and the constant roar of semi-trucks. It was a place where people were sent to be forgotten. I won't do it, I said, standing up. My legs felt like they were made of water. I won't leave my home. You have 1 week to pack your things, Tiffany said, her voice as cold as ice. We have already started the paperwork. Don't make this difficult. It wouldn't look good for a retired nurse to be evicted by her own son. Would it? I looked at them. The three of them, sitting at my table, eating my food, under my roof. They looked like a family, and I looked like an intruder. I realized then that my son had been planning this from the moment he asked to move back home. Every hug, every I love you, every Sunday dinner. It had all been a lie. I walked out of the room without saying another word. I could hear them talking behind me, the sound of their silverware clinking against the plates. They were already celebrating, but as I sat on the edge of my bed, the bed they were about to take from me, I felt a spark of something deep inside. It was not just sadness. It was a cold, sharp clarity. They thought they had won because they had the deed. But they were lazy. They had always been lazy. And in their greed, they had forgotten to check the fine print of my life. They had the house, but they didn't know how the house worked. And I was going to make sure they learned that lesson. One expensive repair at a time. I stood there in my own dining room, the room where I had hosted every Christmas dinner and every birthday party for 30 years. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. I looked at Christopher, waiting for him to tell me it was a joke. I waited for him to say that Tiffany was just being dramatic. But he wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the carving knife in his hand, his knuckles white. Tiffany leaned back in her chair. She didn't look like the sweet daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my home. She looked like a stranger. Her eyes were bright, with a cold, sharp victory. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She slid it across the mahogany table, right next to my plate of half-eaten roast beef. "Go ahead. Take a look," she said, her voice smooth and chilling. "Since you seem to have such a short memory," I picked up the paper. My hands were shaking so badly the page rattled. There, at the top, were the words, "Quitclaim deed." And there, at the bottom, was my signature. My own handwriting. It was shaky. The signature of a woman who had been fighting a fever of 102 degrees. But it was mine. "You told me it was a medical power of attorney," I whispered, looking at Christopher. "You told me it was just so you could talk to the doctors. You lied to me." While I was in a hospital bed, Christopher finally looked up, but there was no apology in his eyes. Only a strange, hollow defensiveness. "We needed to protect the assets." "Mom," he said, "with your health the way it was, we couldn't risk the state taking the house if you ended up in long-term care. It was a family decision. We did it for everyone." "For everyone?" I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, but it was a dry, bitter sound. "You mean you did it for you? You stole my home while I was fighting for my breath," Tiffany chimed in then, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Actually, we did it so we could provide a proper home for my mother. Mrs. Gable deserves the best. And this house is finally being put to good use. You should be happy. You've worked 40 years as a nurse. You're tired. It's time for you to downsize. We're actually doing you a favor." A favor. The word rang in my ears. They had robbed me of my life's work, stripped me of my dignity, and they called it a favor. I looked at the three of them, sitting there, comfortably, in the house I had paid for with 40 years of 12-hour shifts. I realized then that I wasn't a mother to them anymore. I wasn't even a human being with rights. I was just an obstacle to be moved. I looked at the deed again. A quitclaim deed is a powerful thing in the United States. It transfers interest instantly. I knew enough from my years in the medical field, dealing with social workers and elder law, to know that I was in deep trouble. By signing that paper, I had legally gifted my entire life away. No money had changed hands. No sale had occurred. Just a gift. A gift to a son who didn't even dare to look me in the eye. "You're not a man." "Christopher," I said, my voice now calm and cold. "A man doesn't steal from his mother, and a man certainly doesn't hide behind his wife while doing it." Tiffany stood up then, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. "That is enough. This is Christopher's house now. And that means I am the woman of this house. We have been very patient, but our patience has run out. You will move your things out, or we will have the sheriff move them for you. The choice is yours." I looked at the mahogany table, the rose bushes outside the window, the walls I had painted myself. Everything I loved was now behind a glass wall I could no longer touch. I was officially homeless in my own home. I turned away and walked toward the stairs, my legs heavy as lead. Behind me, I heard the sound of Tiffany laughing, a soft, triumphant sound, and the clink of silverware as they went back to their dinner. They were eating my food, in my house, while I went upstairs to figure out where I would sleep in 7 days. 7 days. It is a very short amount of time when you are trying to pack up 40 years of memories. Every morning for that week, I woke up at 5 o'clock, just like I did when I was working at the hospital. But instead of putting on my scrubs, I pulled out cardboard boxes. The house felt different now. It felt cold. Christopher and Tiffany treated me like a ghost. They walked past me in the hallways without speaking. Mrs. Gable spent her days in my master suite, playing her music loud and complaining about the dust I was kicking up while I packed. I started in the attic. I found boxes of Christopher's old-school drawings. I found his first baseball glove. I held it in my hands for a long time. remembering the Saturdays I spent at the park, cheering for him. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. How could that little boy grow up to be the man downstairs? I didn't cry. I didn't have the energy for tears. I just placed the glove in a box, marked trash. I didn't want it anymore. The physical labor was grueling. My back ached, and my hands grew sore from the packing tape. I had to decide what to keep and what to let go. My dining table? Too big for a one-bedroom apartment. My piano? No room. My garden tools? I wouldn't have a yard anymore. I had to sell most of it for pennies on the dollar, or just give it away. Every item I carried out to the driveway felt like a piece of my heart being ripped out. Christopher watched me from the window sometimes, but he never offered to help. Not once. He didn't offer to lift a heavy box. He didn't offer to drive a load to the donation center. He just watched, waiting for me to be gone so they could start redecorating. On the 6th day, I drove over to the apartment complex near the highway. It was a grey, concrete building. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. The manager, a tired-looking man, handed me the keys to Unit 312. The apartment was tiny. The carpet was thin and stained. The windows didn't look out over rose bushes. They looked out over a 6-lane interstate. The roar of the trucks was constant. A low, vibrating thrum that you could feel in your teeth. I stood in the middle of the empty living room and realized this was it. This was where I was supposed to spend my golden years, because I had trusted my son. I went back to the house for the final load. My bedroom was already empty. Tiffany was already in there with a tape measure, talking to a contractor about ripping out the old-fashioned wallpaper. She didn't even acknowledge me as I took the last small box of photos from the closet. As I walked down the stairs for the very last time, I saw Christopher standing by the front door. He looked uncomfortable. He looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe a goodbye. Maybe an apology. But the words didn't come. I hope you're happy, Christopher, I said, pausing with my hand on the doorknob. I hope this house gives you everything you thought you were missing. But remember, you can't build a happy life on a foundation of lies. Mom, it's just a house, he mumbled, looking at his shoes. No, Christopher, I replied. It was a home, and it was mine. Now, it's just a building, and you are welcome to it. I walked out the door and didn't look back. I climbed into my car, my joints stiff and my spirit broken. As I drove away, I saw Tiffany, closing the heavy oak curtains, shutting me out of the world I had built. I spent my first night in the highway apartment, sitting on a folding chair, surrounded by boxes. The noise of the semi-trucks was so loud, I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I felt like I had been discarded, like an old piece of medical equipment that was no longer useful. But as I sat there in the dark, I remembered something. Christopher was lazy. He had always been lazy. He wanted the house, but he didn't understand the house. He didn't know about the private maintenance contracts I had signed for the solar panels. He didn't know about the specialized water filtration system that kept the hard well water from ruining the pipes. He didn't know that I was the sole owner of the small local company that provided those services. I realized then that while they had the deed, I still held the power. I reached for my phone and began making a list of the services I would be cancelling the very next morning. They wanted me out of their lives? Fine. But they were about to find out exactly how much it cost to live the life they had stolen from me. In my 40 years as a registered nurse, I learned one very important lesson. It was a lesson that saved lives in the emergency room, and it was a lesson that would eventually save me. That lesson is: details matter. When you are a nurse, you have to read the fine print on every medication bottle. You have to check every line on a patient's chart. One missed detail, one small mistake, and everything can fall apart. I was a woman who kept folders. I kept receipts. I kept every single contract I had ever signed in a fireproof safe in the basement. Christopher and Tiffany were not like that. They were part of a generation that wanted everything right now, without doing the homework. They were lazy. They were so blinded by the sparkle of the house, and the pride of owning the deed, that they never once stopped to ask how the house actually functioned. They saw the four walls and the roof, but they didn't understand the heartbeat of the property. You see, my house was not a standard suburban home. It sat on a large plot of land that had belonged to my family for a very long time. Because of its location, we had to be self-sufficient. Years ago, I had formed a small, private, limited liability company. I called it Blue Oak Property Services. I did this to manage the maintenance of the well, the private road, and the specialized solar panel system I had installed to save on electricity. When Christopher tricked me into signing that quitclaim deed, he got the house. He got the land. He got the physical structure. But he was too arrogant to check the utility records. He assumed that because he owned the house, everything attached to it was his too. He was wrong. Dead wrong. The solar panels on the roof? They were not owned by the house. They were under a 20-year lease agreement with a major energy corporation, and that lease was held in the name of my private company. The contract specifically stated that if the company stopped making payments, or if the company decided to relocate the service, the panels would be removed immediately. Then, there was the water. In this part of the country, we have what we call hard well water. It is filled with minerals and sediment that can ruin your plumbing in a matter of months. To fix this, I had installed a heavy-duty, industrial-grade filtration system. It was a sophisticated piece of machinery that required monthly chemical balances and professional servicing. Guess who owned the maintenance contract for that system? My company did. Christopher and Tiffany thought they were being so clever. They thought they had left me with nothing. But as I sat in my small, noisy apartment near the highway, I opened my laptop and looked at my business filings. I was still the sole owner and manager of Blue Oak Property Services. I looked at the bank account for the company. There was still plenty of money there, but it was my money, not his. They had taken my sanctuary, but they had forgotten to take the instructions on how to keep it running. They had the car, but I had the engine and the keys. I realized that for the last 2 years, I had been paying the bills for their luxury. I had been paying the solar lease. I had been paying for the water chemicals. I had been paying for the private road plowing in the winter. They had treated me like a servant, while I was the one keeping the lights on. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. My love for my son was a beautiful thing, but it was not a suicide pact. He had chosen greed over his mother. He had chosen Tiffany's schemes over my well-being. And now, he was about to find out exactly how much it cost to be the king of a castle when you don't know how to maintain the moat. The following Monday morning, I woke up early. The sun was just beginning to peek over the highway, and the roar of the trucks was already loud. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman with a plan. I sat down at my small kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and my cell phone. My first call was to the Solar Energy Corporation. I spoke with a representative in the billing department. I told them that Blue Oak Property Services would be terminating the lease for the panels at the old address, effective immediately. The woman on the phone sounded surprised. "But ma'am," she said, "if we remove the panels, the roof will be exposed in several areas where the brackets are installed, and your electricity bill will triple." "That is no longer my concern," I told her firmly. My voice as steady as it was when I used to give medical reports to surgeons. The property has changed hands, and the new owner did not negotiate a transfer of the lease. Please send your crew out this week to reclaim your equipment. Next, I called the water treatment specialists. I told them to stop the monthly chemical deliveries and to cancel the maintenance contract. "The well water there is very aggressive," the technician warned me. "Without that filtration system, The water will turn brown within days. It will stain the toilets. It will ruin the dishwasher. And it will eventually clog the pipes. I understand, I said. Please close the account. I felt a strange sense of peace with every call I made. I was not doing anything illegal. I was not breaking into the house. I was not damaging property. I was simply stopping. I was stopping my generosity. I was stopping my protection. I was allowing the world to work the way Christopher and Tiffany wanted it to work. They wanted to be independent? Fine. Now they were truly on their own. By the end of the day, I had cancelled the road maintenance, the landscaping service, and the specialized security system that I had been paying for. Total, I was saving myself nearly $1,200 a month. That was money that would now go into my own retirement savings. Instead of supporting the people who had betrayed me, I spent the rest of the week waiting. I knew how the house worked. I knew that without the solar panels, the central air conditioning would become too expensive to run. I knew that, without the water filtration, Tiffany's expensive white laundry would start to turn an ugly, rusty orange. I knew that Mrs. Gable, who loved her long, hot baths, would soon find the water smelling like sulfur and rotten eggs. I sat on my small balcony, looking toward the hills where my old house sat. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel like celebrating. But I did feel justified. In the United States, we believe in the law of the land. But there is another law that is even more powerful. The law of consequences. Christopher and Tiffany thought they could build their happiness on the ruins of my life. They thought they could take 40 years of my hard work and just walk away with it. But they had forgotten that a house is more than just a piece of paper. A house is a living thing. And without the person who knows how to care for it, it starts to die. I took a sip of my tea and leaned back. The trucks on the highway were still loud, but for the first time, I couldn't hear them. I was too busy listening to the silence of my own power. I had been a nurse for 40 years, taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves. But the most important patient I ever had was me, and I was finally starting to heal. They say that a house is only as strong as its foundation. But in the modern world, a house is only as good as its systems. Christopher and Tiffany had the deed, but they didn't have the heart to care for the property. They thought that once I was gone, the house would just continue to run itself, like a clock that never needs winding. They were wrong. They were so very wrong. It was a Tuesday morning, barely 3 weeks after I had moved into my small apartment. I drove past the old neighborhood, just to see. I didn't stop. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me, but as I rounded the corner, I saw a sight that made my heart leap with a strange, cold justice. 2 large, orange utility trucks were parked in my old driveway. Men in neon vests were on the roof. I could hear the rhythmic hum of power drills. They were removing the solar panels, one by one. The sleek, black panels were being lowered down. Without my company paying the lease, the energy corporation wasted no time reclaiming their assets. By the time they were finished, the roof of my beautiful home looked like it had been scarred. There were gaps in the shingles, exposed brackets, and long, ugly streaks of dirt where the panels used to sit. I knew what that meant for Christopher. Without solar energy, the electric bill for a 4,000 square foot house would skyrocket. In the heat of the American summer, with the air conditioning running all day, that bill would jump from $80 a month to nearly $900. I could almost hear the sound of Christopher's bank account draining. But it wasn't just the electricity. Without the solar company's specialized roof maintenance, the small leaks I had been monitoring began to grow. A few days later, a heavy summer thunderstorm rolled through the valley. It was a typical American downpour, loud and sudden. In my apartment, I sat by the window and listened to the rain. I knew exactly what was happening at the house. The holes left by the solar brackets were like open wounds. The water would be seeping into the attic, soaking the insulation, and staining the ceilings that I had painted just 2 years ago. I heard from a former neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, that she saw Tiffany screaming at a contractor on the front lawn. Apparently, the master suite ceiling was starting to sag. The fragile Mrs. Gable was reportedly complaining about a damp smell in her new room. Christopher, being as lazy as he was, tried to fix it himself with a bucket and some cheap sealant from the hardware store. But a house like that requires professional care. It requires a woman who knows where the shut-off valves are and which shingles are prone to lifting. Without my 40 years of experience, the house was beginning to reject its new owners. Every day, a new crack would appear. Every night, a new sound would echo through the hallways. The luxury they had stolen was turning into a burden, and they were too proud and too poor to fix it. As a nurse, I have always been obsessed with cleanliness. Clean hands, clean sheets, and most importantly, clean water. When I first bought that property 40 years ago, I knew the water was a problem. It was well water, drawn from deep within the earth. It was cold, but it was hard. It was full of iron, calcium, and sulfur. If you leave that water alone, it will destroy a home. It will turn your white towels into a muddy orange. It will leave a thick, white crust on your faucets. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It smells like rotten eggs. It is a smell that clings to your skin and stays in your hair. That is why I spent $15,000 on a commercial-grade filtration and softening system. It was the heart of the house. It worked silently in the basement, scrubbing the minerals out of the water before it ever reached the taps. But that system was owned by my company, Blue Oak Property Services. And, as of last week, I had officially turned it off. The change happened almost overnight. I can only imagine Tiffany's face when she woke up to take her morning shower. Without the filtration, the water coming out of the showerhead would have been a murky, tea-colored brown. The steam in the bathroom would have carried that heavy, pungent scent of sulfur. I heard through the grapevine that Tiffany had to throw away $500 worth of designer bedsheets because they came out of the wash looking like they had been dipped in rust. The dishwasher, which was brand new, began to hum and groan as the mineral deposits clogged the internal pumps. Finally, they called a professional. They called the best well specialist in the state. I know this because the specialist is an old friend of mine. He called me later that evening, chuckling into the phone. "You wouldn't believe it," he told me. "I went out to your old place. The son, Christopher." He was frantic. He told me the water was poisoned. I took one look at the pipes and told him the truth. I told him his filtration system was deactivated, and the internal components were already fouled by the iron. I asked him what he told Christopher the cost would be. "Well," my friend said, "to dig a new well, install a modern, high-capacity filtration system that meets the current county codes, and replace the pipes that are already showing signs of corrosion." I gave him a quote of $65,000. $65,000. I almost dropped my tea. I knew they didn't have $65,000. Christopher had spent his savings on a new car to impress Tiffany's mother. Tiffany had spent her money on new furniture for the room they stole from me. "What did he say?" I asked. "He turned white as a sheet," the specialist replied. "He tried to tell me he was the owner. And I had to fix it for free under the old contract. I told him the old contract was with a private company, and that company had cancelled the service. He started shouting about lawyers. So I just packed up my tools and left. $65,000. That was the price of their greed. They had a house they couldn't live in. They couldn't bathe. They couldn't wash their clothes. They couldn't even drink a glass of water without gagging. Mrs. Gable, the woman who was so fragile, apparently moved out that very same afternoon. She told Tiffany she refused to live in a third world country and went to stay with a cousin in Florida. They were alone now, Christopher and Tiffany, trapped in a beautiful, rotting mansion with no clean water and a leaking roof. They had cheated me out of my home, but they had forgotten that a home is a gift that must be maintained with respect. They had the deed. Yes, but the house was now their prison. And I was sitting in my small, clean apartment, drinking a glass of clear, filtered water. And finally, I was at peace. They say that adversity introduces a person to themselves. But in my experience, adversity introduces you to the truth about the people around you. For months, I had heard nothing but how fragile Mrs. Gable was. My son, Christopher, would lower his voice every time he spoke about her. He treated her like she was a delicate piece of heirloom china that would shatter if the wind blew too hard. Tiffany would sigh and talk about her mother's poor nerves and her need for a peaceful, luxurious environment. But that fragility was a costume. It was a mask they used to justify taking my bedroom and my home, and as soon as the luxury disappeared, the mask fell off. It was the middle of July, a week after the solar panels were hauled away. In this part of the country, July is unforgiving. The heat index was reaching 105 degrees every afternoon. Without the solar panels, the cost of running the central air conditioning was astronomical. Christopher, trying to save money because of his growing debts, decided to turn the thermostat up to 85 degrees. The house became a furnace. The beautiful master suite, with its large windows, trapped the sun's heat like a greenhouse. And then there was the water. The sulfur smell from the well was now so strong that you could smell it the moment you walked through the front door. The water was brown, the house was hot, and the fragile Mrs. Gable had finally had enough. I heard the story from my friend, Martha, who lives 3 houses down. She saw the whole thing from her front porch. She told me that a sleek, black SUV pulled into the driveway. Mrs. Gable didn't look fragile that day. She was moving with the speed and energy of a woman half her age. She was barking orders at Christopher, pointing her cane at her heavy suitcases like a general on a battlefield. Christopher was sweating through his shirt, pleading with her to stay. He told her that he would fix the roof. He promised her that he would get the water system back online. But Mrs. Gable wasn't interested in promises. She wanted comfort. She wanted the life she thought she had stolen. And since that life was gone, she was gone too. "I will not live like a peasant," she shouted, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. She told Tiffany that she was disappointed in her for marrying a man who couldn't even provide clean water. She didn't offer to help pay for the repairs. She didn't offer her own savings to help my son. She just climbed into the back of that SUV and drove away, headed for a luxury hotel in the city. I sat in my small, air-conditioned apartment and thought about the irony of it all. They had destroyed my life to take care of a woman who didn't even like them. Their family unity was built on a foundation of air conditioning and filtered water. Once the convenience was gone, the love was gone too. Tiffany was left in a hot, stinking house, with a husband she was starting to resent. The fragility was gone, replaced by a cold, bitter reality. They had traded their mother for a guest who didn't even say goodbye. The end did not come with a bang. It came with a yellow piece of paper taped to the front door. It was a notice of default. In my 40 years as a nurse, I have seen what happens when a person ignores a wound for too long. It festers. It spreads. Eventually, it consumes everything. Christopher had a wound in his finances, and instead of fixing it, he had tried to cover it with a stolen house. But a house is not just a place to live. It is a liability if you don't know how to manage it. I soon discovered the darkest secret of all. While I was in the hospital, Christopher hadn't just stolen the deed. He had used the equity in the house, the 40 years of my hard work, to take out a secret second mortgage. He wanted to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford. He wanted to buy Tiffany jewelry. He wanted to pay for Mrs. Gable's expensive tastes. He had taken out a loan for over $200,000, thinking that the house would always be there to protect him. But the bank is not a mother. The bank does not care if you are fragile or if you made a mistake. When Christopher stopped making the payments because he was overwhelmed by the utility bills and the repair costs, the bank moved in. I remember the day the foreclosure became official. I was driving to the grocery store when I decided to take a detour past the old house. There was a sign in the yard. Not a for sale sign, but a legal notice. The windows were dark. The grass, which I had kept green and lush for decades, was brown and dying. The rose bushes were withered, their petals scattered in the dirt. Christopher had lost it all. He had stolen the house from me just to lose it to a corporation. He had traded my love and my security for a loan he couldn't repay. Tiffany, seeing that the well was truly dry, had moved out a week before the bank arrived. I heard she moved back in with her mother, who was now living in a condo in Florida. She didn't take Christopher with her. She took the furniture, she took the jewelry, and she left him with the debt. I stood at the edge of the property, looking at the house that had been my life's work. I felt a deep, heavy sadness, but I also felt a strange sense of closure. The house was gone. The sanctuary was broken, but I was still standing. I was a nurse. I was a survivor. Christopher had thought that he could build a kingdom on a foundation of lies. He thought that because he had the paper, he had the power. But the bank had the last word. They changed the locks. They boarded up the windows where the leaks had ruined the drywall. They treated my 40 years of memories like a toxic asset. I drove away, looking in the rearview mirror. I saw the house getting smaller and smaller. It was just a building now, a cold, empty shell. I realized that my son hadn't just lost a house. He had lost his soul. He had traded his mother's heart for a second mortgage. And in the end, he was left with nothing but the interest. 1 year. That is how long it has been since I walked away from the house I spent 40 years paying for. 1 year of living in my own space, on my own terms. I eventually moved out of that noisy apartment near the highway. I found a small, charming cottage in a quiet neighborhood, far away from the roar of the trucks and the shadows of my past. It has a beautiful front porch, painted a soft, welcoming white, and a garden full of hydrangeas that bloom in the most brilliant shades of blue. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The air was warm, smelling of freshly cut grass and summer rain. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying a tall glass of cold lemonade, with just a hint of mint from my garden. I felt a sense of peace that I had not known for a very long time. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a nurse taking care of everyone else. I was just me. Then, I saw a car pull into my driveway. It was a beat-up, silver sedan. The muffler was loud, and there was a large dent in the passenger side door. It was not the kind of car Christopher used to drive. He used to be so proud of his luxury vehicles, the ones he bought with money he didn't have. The door creaked open, and my son stepped out. I almost didn't recognize him. In just 1 year, he seemed to have aged a decade. His hair was messy, and there were deep, dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were wrinkled, and he looked like a man who had been sleeping in his car. He stood there for a moment, looking at my new house, looking at the flowers, looking at the life I had built without him. He walked toward the porch, his steps slow and hesitant. He didn't have that arrogant, smug look on his face anymore. The pride was gone. The greed was gone. All that was left was a broken, defeated man. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't stand up. I didn't drop my glass. I just looked at him. I looked at the boy I had raised, the man who had stolen my home while I was in a hospital bed. The bank took the house. "Mom," he said, his eyes filling with tears. Tiffany left me months ago. She went back to Florida with her mother. She took everything, the furniture, the savings, everything. I tried to find a job, but I couldn't keep up with the debts. I've been staying in motels, but I ran out of money 3 days ago. He took a step closer, reaching out a hand as if to touch the railing of my porch. I have nowhere to go. Mom, he sobbed. I'm so tired. Can I just, please, can I just sleep on your sofa for a few days? Just until I get back on my feet? I don't need anything else. Just a place to lay my head. I sat there, listening to his voice. I remembered the night he told me to move to the apartment near the highway. I remembered the way Tiffany had smiled when she told me I was a guest in my own home. I looked at the man standing in my driveway, and I realized that the person I loved, the son I thought I had, didn't exist. This was just a stranger who happened to have my son's face. The silence between us grew long. The only sound was the chirping of the birds in the trees and the distant hum of a lawnmower. He was waiting for me to be the nurse. He was waiting for me to be the mother who always forgives, always provides, and always sacrifices. But that woman had died in the hospital a year ago. I sit here today, in my small, quiet garden, and I finally understand what it means to be free. For 40 years, I was defined by my work as a registered nurse. I was the one who cared for the sick, the one who held the hands of the dying, and the one who sacrificed my own sleep to provide for my son. I thought that by giving Christopher everything, I was teaching him how to be a good man. I was wrong. I was only teaching him how to take. When I watched his beat-up car drive away from my cottage for the last time, I did not feel the sting of guilt. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face. I realized that my responsibility to him ended the moment he decided that his greed was more important than my survival. I spent 40 years paying off a mortgage, but the most important thing I ever truly owned was my own peace of mind. To my friends out there who are watching this, especially those of you who have worked hard your whole lives, please hear me. Do not let your love for your children blind you to the reality of their choices. Protect your assets. Read every single line of every document. And most importantly, remember that you deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor without being made to feel like a guest in your own life. Christopher is still out there somewhere, struggling to find his way. I hope he finds it. I really do. But he will have to find it without my roof over his head. I have learned that the hardest lessons are often the most valuable ones. I taught him that he cannot build his happiness on the ruins of my life. And I taught myself that I am enough. Note: while this story is a fictional narrative created for your entertainment, the message and the lesson it carries about protecting yourself and your future are very real and very important. If you believe that karma always finds its way home, and if you believe that every mother deserves respect, please give this video a like, share it with a friend who might need this reminder, and subscribe to Elderly Stories for more tales of justice and wisdom. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Stay safe, be wise, and cherish your peace.